Choose. What subject would you integrate in a school CLIL program? Would you go for a high context subject such as art or PE, or for others not so rich in context such as maths or science, and why?
Okay, so the whole issue about which curricular subjects can be taught through another language. Any subjects can be taught through the medium of another language. But just as when they're taught in first language, different subjects have different kinds of demands. So if we've got art and PE, that's much more active in a sense, physically active, than say maths or science. So I think the next reason for choosing a subject would be which teachers are the ones that really feel like this is what they want to do, like their English is okay, they feel relatively confident. It does not matter if they make mistakes, but at least they feel relatively confident. So that's a key factor to take into consideration. Another key factor is the learners themselves. How old are they? How long have they been learning English? It does not, however, require learners to have a particular level in English before they start. And I really want to make that clear. You can have beginners doing secondary science through the medium of English. It's very, very time consuming for the teacher because they have to do a lot of preparation, which you normally would never ever do. But it is possible, and you have to have a lot of resources to hand and so on. So I think the key consideration is, rather than the subject itself, is first of all the teachers and where the expertise may well lie, or the interest, the motivation to do this, if there's a complete choice, and then looking at the learners themselves. Now, in art or PE, obviously that there's potentially less language, but I don't really believe that. I think we do just as much talking in art and PE as we do, but the register's slightly different. So it's looking at the kind of language that you would need. So if, for example, you were doing physical education and you were analysing a sports video, then you would need relatively not only scientific vocabulary and phrases that went with that particular sport, but you'd also need to have the kind of language at your disposal which enabled you to comment on the strategic skills and so on of the learners. So I actually believe that there's no easier version of any of the subjects. Having said that, some subjects are very, very text bound, and there I'm looking at something like history and possibly English if it's based on literature. And those texts, they're not necessarily a bad thing, because one of the skills that is really useful to have is to not be frightened if you see a text that looks very long and complicated and you don't immediately understand every word. And I think if we can train our young people to not be put off by that, but to look for clues, then textual clues can sometimes be just as valuable as the kind of text, which might be physical text or whatever. That they're different, but they're just as valuable in terms of the discourse agenda, repertoire, if you like, of individuals. So it's not an easy question to answer, because I don't think that if you're going to do those subjects in the way that you would do in the first language, I really, really don't think that there's a huge difference between them. But I do feel that the text-heavy subjects, such as English and history, require quite a lot of analysis of the kinds of materials that you would use. So authentic text, for example, is likely, if it's at an appropriate cognitive level, is likely to be quite difficult. So you need to find ways of breaking the text down without it being boring and tedious. So looking for meaning and visual clues and so on and so forth, it's possible. But obviously, with those students that have got a high level of English, then it becomes more and more sophisticated. So I think that's what I would say about subjects. Again, if I go right back to my first question, it really depends on what you want the learners to do, and I think it should be authentic. I don't think we should be making things easy. But I think the last thing I would say on that one would be there is always going to be a difference between the cognitive level and the linguistic level of learners in CLIL. The higher up they go, the less the gap, usually. But for me, the critical thing is that we never ever dumb down the content of what we're doing. And our job as CLIL teachers, which is really quite challenging at times, is to find ways and strategies and tasks of making the knowledge accessible to the learners when their language isn't as good as it would be in their first language. But we never ever must lower the cognitive level. You know, sometimes I see children who've been working on sustainability, and say 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and in the foreign language they've done a beautiful poster and they've just got one name for the animal that's in danger. And unless that's an art lesson, and so a lot of language has gone on around how you drew the polar bear or whatever it happened to be, just simply cutting and pasting an animal that's in danger and putting the label of that animal underneath, to me, is not appropriate for an 8-year-old, even though it's in English. It's appropriate for the early years children, of course, but it's not at the cognitive level. They should, by 8, be able to say more or write more or be supported to do more with sustainability, climate change, polar bears, whatever it happens to be, just a little bit more. And that's where I would go on that at all times. Whatever the subject, we should never ever lower the level at which that subject is being taught. And that's a challenge. Yeah.
It is a challenge, and it's, like you said, a carefully planning work that must be done.
Yeah.
But it's reachable.
Yeah.
It's reachable because I have seen kids in their second language being able to debate, being able to contrast information, to share it. So there's no bounds, there's no limits.
No,
it's just about carefully planning it and actually having clear in mind what do you want to get from your students. What do you want them to get or to reach.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.